Hello, my name is Mordred Viking, and I'd like to welcome you to this brand new series, I guess you would call it, although it's really a continuation of the Crusader Kings II game. This is Europa Universalis IV, March of the Vikings. In Crusader Kings II, the objective was basically to get from Gotland across Holmgard, through Konungard, into the Black Sea, through the Mediterranean, through Egypt or Persia, either way, and then eventually end up in India. And this is part of what's known as a mega campaign, where basically we take the progress in one game, convert it across to the next one, work through that. So we've done Crusader Kings II. This is now the Europa Universalis section. Then after this, we will have Victoria II, which brings us through the Industrial Age. And then if there is a working converter, I don't know that there is right now, into Hearts of Iron 4. So, what happened at the last episode? Well, basically, the Vikings did actually make it into India. And I have been working on this converted game. There are now 30 nations with custom national focuses. I've spent a ridiculous amount of time building them, like 10 hours yesterday alone. And I'm at the stage where I'm quite happy to show this off and basically get started. So this episode's all going to be about talking about the different factions, their strengths, their weaknesses, and that type of thing, what I'm expecting them to do. And then the next episode will be us playing properly. There are one or two little tweaks that I still want to make. For example, the idea selection. Some of the Catholic nations don't seem very interested in taking exploration or expansion, which means the colonial race doesn't really get started until the 1600s or so, which is way too late. Speaking of which, there are a number of changes in this, like all of those 30 nations have their own custom idea groups, which I've built. Like here you can see Mordred ideas. Some of them are very threadbare. So Mordred, I've done the full work. So we have the Adventuring Vikings, it has the title, it has the description, but for many of the others it doesn't. It just has like Y60 ideas. That's just because I could not be bothered to write out descriptions and stuff for each and every one of them. So you will be seeing just the raw coding stuff. But all the bonuses do work. Like, the important bit is there. In the future, I might flesh those out, but that was very, very low on my list of priorities. You will be able to find this mod on Steam Workshop in the coming days, probably sooner rather than later. And over time, I might well update it with those things. And because they are just text values, they should just update just fine into save games once that is actually running. Beyond that, I can't really see us making any other changes. I'm pretty happy with the balance. I've run about 20 games in the background just to see how things work. And I'm really pleased with it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to dive in. I'm going to go into more detail about Mordred itself, because that is the nation that we will be playing as. That's this blue stripe over here, plus the Maldives. And then a overview of the Indian factions. There are 5 Viking nations in India, plus of course a couple of Indian nations that are important. And then we'll talk about what's happening in the Norse kingdoms of Scandinavia and Russia, and then some of the important Catholics over there as well. For the rest of the world, they should just basically function like vanilla. With the exception of Mongolia, but I'll talk about that a bit later. Okay, so Mordred. What is Mordred? Mordred is the most imperialistic of the nations. They have a lot of prestige, a lot of legitimacy, that type of thing, just because I thought that fitted their culture most. But they also have some pretty powerful other abilities because they were the flagstone of the Scandinavian Empire, which has been broken down into these smaller factions to make for a more interesting game here. So we have got the Mordgardian traditions. They can raid coasts. Every single Norse nation can raid coasts. That is one of the things I've been very careful to implement. So anyone that has Norse religion or Norse culture raids. And that's going to be very interesting. Like throughout Crusader Kings II, even right up to the end, we were raiding stuff really quite actively, as were the vassals. And I thought, you know what, that is entirely appropriate to have continue. So we've done that. So all of the custom nations have them, plus I've also got a generic idea group for anyone else who is Norse that has not been given a custom idea group. So for example, Vestergautland has this Norse generic group which gives them may raid coasts, and that has some interesting connotations which I'll go through. So may raid coasts, they have advisor costs. That's basically to ensure that they have some more monarch points. Yearly legitimacy +1. And then once they have all of their ideas, the capstone is global settler increase and trade steering. So that's envisioning a more colonial, more widespread nation. We have the Adventuring Vikings, and this is a trait shared by all of the Indian Viking nations, and that's to give them missionary strength and culture conversion costs, which they will need to survive there. Then we have the Memories of Conungard, which gives us a development cost minus 20%, because we were always investing very heavily into developing our holdings, and that remains true. That is what we did. Scandinavian classics, again, technology, another thing I focus very heavily on in Crusader Kings II, so it's only proper that we continue with that. We have got infantry combat ability in honour of the large groups of Huskarls that we kept, even at great expense. Legacy of Gotland. Gotland is the county where it all started. Gotland is now a merchant republic, so in memory and according to the legacy of Gotland, we have some trade ability. And then Mordred's monument. Mordred the 12th, who is actually the current king, he survived throughout the end of the game, was an absolute badass. I mean, he did so much stuff, it was ridiculous. So he's built a monument to himself. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get the numbering to work here. So King Mordred Viking, that is Mordred the 12th. You can see 466. He's a bloody good king. That was not me. That was the converter generation. And then we have Mordred II as the heir, though that's not going to display. It does, which will be Mordred II, but he's really Mordred the 13th, but I couldn't get that working. Then we have the Saga of the Titans, which is, of course, hearkening to the Saga of the Titans series that I've going with Aigil and Bussi, and I just thought that was kind of a nice nod to that. So that is Mordgard. Mordgard is a pretty well-developed area. It's quite rich, but in many of the test games, they were the last of the Viking nations standing, but probably 70% of the time they lost. So it's going to be a challenging game all the same, just because we are so isolated. Speaking of isolation, though, we are nowhere near as isolated as Nummerland up here. They are all about being isolationist, they're defensive, they're there basically trying to survive and struggle to stay. So they have the usual adventuring Vikings ability, they have land force limits, idea cost, manpower, discipline, cavalry, mercenaries, and they also have a lot of fort defense and hostile core creation costs. Now, the interesting thing with the hostile core creation is the AI does take that into account when choosing who to attack. So if you have hostile core creation, you are less likely to be attacked by the AI, which means that Nummerland actually survives longer than you might think they would, just because they don't get targeted. Now, this is in contrast to the Vaingomagard over here, who take the opposite view. They are all about diplomacy. They're about integrating themselves with the Indian populations. And because of that, they're quite progressive, quite forward-thinking, and very, very tolerant. So they have diplomatic reputation, which should help in allowing them to actually establish alliances with the Indian nations. Improved relations, same thing. And they can promote more cultures. They have the usual adventuring Vikings. Idea cost, because they're sharing ideas with the Indians. It's all quite open. Manpower, fort defense, tech cost, same reason. Construction cost, development cost. So they're a very, very economic nation. But if they lose their allies, then quite frankly, they are screwed. Now, that in itself is in contrast to Fuertebagoland, which is definitely my favourite name. It means Land of the White Tiger. Brilliant name. Love it. These guys are your quintessential Viking warriors. They're not so much the Viking raiders as the Viking warriors. They are very good at fighting. They don't have quite so much looting as some of the others. So infantry combat ability, shock damage received. Now, you will notice throughout this that there are a couple of ideas here which you may not ordinarily see in the game. So shock damage received, I think like one nation gets that. I've been a little more generous in giving those types of things out because I think it adds an interesting bent. So this is basically saying these guys are heavily armoured. They have really good infantry, heavy armour compared to the Indians, shock damage received reduction. And then discipline as the final capstone. They're adventuring Vikings, they have land, leader shock, looting speed, so they do have some raiding, though that comes later than some of the other Norse nations. Morale of armies, tax modifier, land force limits, naval force limits, ship durability and production efficiency. Right, then we have Ulstervik. These are the merchants. This is a merchant republic. This is the only Norse Indian merchant republic, though there are many other Norse merchant republics too. They are also able to raid coasts, light ship combat ability, trade range, naval force limit, merchants, global trade power, mercenaries, interest, trade efficiency, morale of navies, trade steering. So this is what I call a ranged merchant republic. There are different types of merchant republic essentially that you can play as. So this one is ranged. It's all about spreading out with lots and lots of light ships and pulling trade back to the home node without necessarily multiplying what is in the home node. So a nation like Amalfi, for example, is a more domestic... No, actually the best example would be Denmark. Denmark is a more domestic trading nation, which is all about multiplying the trade that they have in their node without actually actively being so... they don't so actively pull trade in. They just multiply what's there already. Okay, and then we have this tiny guy up here, which is Egegard. They've actually got a really nice set of ideas. They are the most expansionist. Ironically enough, they have got allows recruitment of explorers and conquistadors. Now, this is actually something which a number of the Norse nations have. This is hearkening to Norway. Norway has the legacy of the explorers, or saga of the explorers, something like that, which gives them the ability to send out explorers, and they also get free colonists in the idea afterwards. And the idea there basically is they just go and colonize, even without colonization or expansion ideas. So there should be more colonization, there should be more nations colonizing in this, which is why I'm a little bit gutted that there has been so little of it, so I do need to tweak a few things. But that's the way that I'm hoping it works. So we'll have a lot of smaller colonial nations all fighting against each other. I think that'll be a lot more interesting. So these guys are very much here in perfectly positioned to go after Indonesia and Australia. Goods produced, production efficiency, global settler increase, naval force limits. They're very much the colonial guys. Okay, so that is the Norse nations here. Then we have one nation which is Indian, Shura, which I have had to do quite a bit of work actually to make stronger. So basically, when we arrived here in Crusader Kings II and took over what you see now, there was the Empire of Shura, which controlled basically the whole of North India, and they were hugely powerful. I had to break them up a little bit, and Shura is the remnant of that. They have got Ottoman ideas, just because I know that the Ottoman ideas are really quite strong. But further to that, I've also given them some vassals and some claims. So their vassals currently are Bikramapuritz and Bangal of Armand. Sorry, I'm going to be absolutely butchering these names. So these two are vassals, which they should be able to integrate pretty quickly. They have a Liberty Desire, I think 30. They also have claims on everything else green in this area. Permanent claims. So they should be able to expand out to grab that. Although, don't underestimate Manas and Sindas over here. And in fact, Scandus itself, this coastal area is really, really rich, which means Scandus at the moment can stand up against Shura even with the vassals, and does. Like, very often I don't see Shura actually conquering Scandus. They take most of the rest, but not Scandus. So it'll be interesting to see what they do in this. And then the rest of these nations, they are very much fragmented and quite loose, but in the nature of EU4, it does get consolidated by one or two nations. Alright, so that's that talked about. Next one over here would be the Vikings. The Vikings were an interesting faction actually in CK2. They are a holy order which I gave lands here in Egypt, and then they actually expanded out and took more of Egypt. Now I had to trim down the amount of land that Taurika had and give it to the Vikings, because in about 99% of all the test games, the Vikings died, and they died horribly. Like, within the first 10 years they were gone. They now survive for a little bit longer. There's probably a 25% chance that they survive and actually take Egypt, but at least that chance is there. So once this mod is up on Steam Workshop, I think the Vikings will be a very interesting game to play as. It's going to be the Vikings, Mordred, and probably Gotland would be the really interesting ones, though you can of course take your pick. So Vikings have got the Viking ideas just from... They're actually an idea group in EU4, but I have beefed them up a little bit, because I have noticed that I've beefed up most of the custom ideas for the other nations, so I kind of needed to make sure that they were in line with that. Now, their other Norse neighbour over here are Taurika, who are actually based up here. They are a merchant republic, and they were all about trying to seize control of the Silk Road in Crusader Kings II, which is why they have kind of so many outposts out here, because they were trying to grab the trade coming in through the Red Sea. So they still control the coast. I had to give the Vikings some more of the land behind them just to beef the Vikings up, because Taurika did have this land over here to fall back on. They, kind of like Austervik, actually are a ranged merchant republic. They're all about pulling trade in and using that. Sorry, I'm just going to quickly glance over the Vikings idea so you have an idea of what they do. I'm not going to talk about them too much. If you want to see them, pause the video. And that's going to be true for most of them. Like, it takes a long time to do that, and I kind of want to get through all of this in a fairly reasonable amount of time. I do have 30 nations to cover. Okay, so Taurika, they are missionary strength trade steering. There you go, straight away trade steering. So they are all about adventuring out and pulling trade in, and then using it and, yeah, becoming rich that way. They do also have a couple more land abilities, like the mercenaries, because they are more... they're less isolated than some of the other merchant republics over here in Genoa, and even Amalfi. Gotland's probably the most secure of them all. Right, so that's Taurika. Who else? The ecumenical patriarchy. I've basically copy and pasted the papal ideas and tweaked a couple of things. So the Pope is more tolerant, strangely. Is that right? No, I think they are actually about the same. I've just changed the wealth a little bit for the patriarchy, and I think I made the Pope a bit more diplomatic. But the patriarch is basically the Orthodox Pope, and he does have his own papal states up here in North Africa, and this is from Crusader Kings II. When I split up Byzantium, that is what spat out. So another interesting player. Byzantium, I have not changed their ideas at all because they're already pretty decent. But Byzantium was extremely powerful. They remain extremely powerful. A lot of the purple stuff around here are vassals, and they gobble those up pretty quickly. So definitely remain a very major power. And in fact, most of the games, they are the number one power in the game. There might be one or two other contenders, depending on how the game goes, but generally Byzantium does very, very well indeed. It's a wealthy area, it's good technology, and they just do really well. And it's basically an already consolidated, more or less, Ottoman Empire. Okay, let's head north. Wallachia is another of the minor Norse nations. You can see here the generic ideas. Myriad coasts, morale of armies, looting, so they're very much the Viking raiders. And I've tried to make these a little bit more balanced, because this has to cover a whole range of different nations. So there you can see merchants and colonists, because the Vikings were known for straying abroad and either settling or trading, not always fighting. Obviously they fought sometimes, but for example going to Danelaw, which was half of England, they just settled it, having conquered it. Alright, Alania, potentially a regional power, haven't done anything with their ideas, these are just going to be generic, so anything that you see here, just national ideas with the seemingly normal. What happens is the converter is actually very clever. It creates a dynamic set of ideas for each nation once you actually hit play, which is why I can't show you what they are now. So it's actually different every game, so my custom ideas are actually going to mess with that a little bit, but should still be fine. And generally they're actually quite strong. Like they're pretty well decided based on their traits and factors of Crusader Kings II. So I really like how the dynamic idea system works. Okay, so Konungard. Konungard was for a very long time the capital of the Scandinavian Empire. So it is kind of the jewel in, well, actually it's Svitjod's really the jewel, but Konungard is like one of the most progressive, one of the strongest regions of the Norse nations. However, they are also in a very dangerous area. They are right adjacent to Byzantium, Poland, Bavaria, and also some of the other Norse nations over here. Like this whole region, like I'm really, really pleased with how Finland, Holmgard, Konungard, Volga, Bulgaria, and Poland are all extremely well balanced against each other. And the balance of power in this region could tip very easily in one direction or another, and then tip away again. So I've seen Konungard like take out Holmgard, only to be then taken out by Poland, who is themselves destroyed by Australasia. Like all kinds of things happen. It's really interesting. It would be really interesting playing in this area too. So Konungard, they have got raiding as usual. They have some more of the constructiony stuff. They have the ability to raise some pretty decent armies. Legitimacy because they were the former capital. Tech again because they were pretty progressive. And then my favourite bit of this is they make the most use of ranged units. So land fire damage, that's another of the traits you don't see very often. And also siege ability and artillery combat ability later on. So later they really embrace gunpowder, as does Nordiriki actually. I'll talk about that in a minute. So Volga, Bulgaria, this is the latest addition to the Norse Empire, not including Bilge. So they use cavalry a little bit more than others. So cavalry cost, cavalry ability, you can see there. But they do still have the Norse heritage. So as a result of that, they have got, where is it? Okay, it's not these guys, it's actually Bilge I'm talking about. But these guys are all based around raiding. So prestige from land battles, army tradition from land battles plus 50%. So if they are fighting, they're doing well. If they're at peace, then they're going to stagnate, especially with their looting abilities too. Bilge. Bilge are actually one of my favourite nations to have happened in Crusader Kings II. They are a Mongol horde that converted to Norse. I didn't do anything with that, it just happened over time. Bilge became Norse. So yes, they do have the May raid coasts ability. Plus, they have the looting speed increase, which is somewhere early on. There it is, looting speed plus 25%. Plus, because they are a steppe horde, it means they have another 50%. So they actually have 75% looting speed. So they are amazing at fighting stuff. And also, this is what I was talking about with the Norse heritage. Shock damage received reduction plus their cavalry combat ability means their cavalry are going to be scary. My idea there basically being they are Viking warriors which intermixed with Mongol warriors both mounted, both heavily armoured. They're basically heavily armoured horse archers, is what I see Bilge as being, and that is reflected in their ideas. Okay, so that is Bilge. Let's head over to Holmgard. Holmgard are what were called Russ in Crusader Kings II. They were an independent Norse nation for a very, very, very long time, and I was trying to conquer them for about 2 centuries and never did until the very end. So they are very, very individualist, and you can see that from the attrition from enemies, core creation cost on us. They are tough to conquer. I mean, they are kind of fairly northern, but they are the new Russia. They can form large armies, lots of manpower, and squish that way. Actually, speaking of Russia, Volga, Bulgaria have got the Russian adjacent provinces are automatically discovered when a colony is built and colonists +1, which is how Russia colonizes Siberia. Volga, Bulgaria is the only one to have this ability. So if they manage to get through the Mongols, then they will have access to Siberia and can grow really quite strong because of that. Speaking of the Mongols, actually, Mongolia, you will notice here, is one big unified state. That is the default state at the end of Crusader Kings II, because the game doesn't really know what's happened to the Mongols. What happens almost immediately is they suffer a massive rebel uprising. I have a feeling it's scripted, and that will fragment Mongolia more dynamically based on the events of that. So you will see smaller Mongol hordes pop out of this, and then I think it is still possible to unite them into the Golden Horde as a formidable nation, but it doesn't start as such. Mongolia just fragments. Okay, so Finland. Finland were the most aggressive of the Norse nations, bar none. They conquered most of England, Ireland. No, did they take Ireland? Yeah, I think they did take Ireland at one point, though Denmark then flipped it. But virtually everything in England that is Norse, and that is quite a lot, that was all thanks to Finland. So Finland have got a lot of ideas which are all about being aggressive. Looting speed there, infantry combat ability, core creation, cost reduction, aggressive expansion reduction. They are all about conquest, as I think is befitting how they played. Now, Nordiriki were an annoying one to produce because they didn't really do anything memorable whatsoever in Crusader Kings. They were just there. They didn't have particularly good armies, they were really poor, and just, I did not know what to do with them to make them interesting. So basically what I thought is, okay, they live in the far north of Scandinavia. Those guys must be freaking hard as nails. So they have got a very high shock damage received, bonus also hostile core creation on us, so people don't want to conquer them very much, and if they do, then they're in for a big fight. And then later on, this is thickly forested and also mountainous here in the north, so hunting is a big part of their way of life, which means they have infantry combat ability and land fire damage with this idea here, and that's basically saying, okay, we're going to start conscripting all of these hunters and giving them guns, like Austrian Jaegers. So that is the idea there. So eventually Nordiriki can get some really, really scary shooting ability, and then later on some pretty decent navies with all the forests that they can build. So yeah, Nordiriki actually became quite an interesting nation. Alright, Svitjod. Svitjod are the jewel in the Scandinavian crown. They are very wealthy, they're very well developed, and they're very technologically advanced. They are also one of the most colonial nations, controlling, as they do, part of South Spain here. This is all Svitjod. Now, in the conversion, they had 2 massive vassals, and those vassals every single time split away and became independent. I didn't want that to happen, so I've integrated some of those lands, like particularly most of this was owned by the vassal it shouldn't have been. So the vassals are now a lot smaller, meaning that Svitjod itself can become a regional power. And in fact, all of the Norse nations can become regional powers in their own right. Like, it is actually pretty well balanced, I have to say. So Svitjod, what do they get? They get construction, diplomatic relations, money, colonial range, because they are the colonizers. They again have the allows recruitment of explorers and conquistadors without expansion or exploration. And they should be able to expand quite nicely. They have a bit of northern Norway over there, plus Spain, of course. And their vassal is Vestergautland. Norway. Norway was always one of my surprising nations. They always had way bigger armies than you would expect in Crusader Kings II, so I've tried to reflect that here. Their army is really, really strong. Infantry combat ability, land leader shock, you can see there. Morale of armies at the end. They're kind of the Norse Prussia. And then land maintenance modifier, force limit modifier, missionaries, army tradition. So their army is scary. It's relatively small. I mean, it has some things which allows it to expand, but yeah, scary. And I think their vassals are Vestlandet and Bergslagen. No, Bergslagen's English. Yeah, Vestlandet is Norwegian. Okay, Denmark. Let's talk about Denmark. Denmark, I did mention earlier, saying that they have the domestic trade policy. They are not a merchant republic, they just make a lot of money through trade, and there is a reason for that. It's because Crusader Kings II, with the conversion, has completely changed where all of the centres of trade are, so those tend to be centred around the actual trading areas. So Taurika has a couple, there's a couple of them up here, and strangely, there's a whole bunch of trading centres here. Sealand, I think, is one, Lund is one, Holland I think might be one. Unfortunately I can't show you that here because it doesn't actually display, but there's a whole bunch of trading nodes here. So Denmark has the domestic trade power plus 33%, which is huge. It means that they just lock down any trade in this area. So anyone else who wants to compete financially has to fight Denmark. And I should also point out that Lübeck and Hamburg are not centres of trade in this game. It's all based in this area. So Denmark has the potential to become extremely wealthy because they're a prominent trading position. Plus, they also have the colonial stuff, which you're probably grown used to seeing because they own Ireland. They did do some fair expansion of their own. So Denmark have the ability to head over to the Americas too and then pull money into the Lübeck node. Okay, so speaking of England, let's start with England. England is a nation which I split out of Finland in Crusader Kings II to basically mitigate Finland's growing strength because they were becoming a threat. England in this is not your usual naval power. They do get some naval abilities later on, including ship durability, yearly naval tradition, ship costs, but these are literally at the end of their list. Early on, they're about aggressive expansion, land fire, and military. They can grow a pretty big military. Now, one of the things that I really like about Great Britain in this game is every single test game that I've played, nobody has managed to unite the whole thing. Has not happened, not once. There's always 2 or 3 large powers, Germany usually, England very often, sometimes Finland, sometimes Norway, that grow big enough that the others just can't compete. So this area remains a huge battlefield, so it's entirely reasonable that all the parties in England are fighters. Like, this is never unified. It might in this game, it might be unified under Mordred, we'll see. But until now, it has not happened. Right, so what other powers do we have here in England? We have Finland still, we have Deb and Ruth. Unfortunately, that was Wales, was kind of hoping we'd do the same as England, but never did. And then Jorvik, which I think is a Finnish, vassal. So Finland has a lot of power over here, but they are rivaled themselves by England, Denmark, and Germany. Germany are freaking hilarious. They are the Finland of the Catholic world. Super aggressive. Aggressive is the only way to really describe them. They took over Scotland and Northern Ireland. They also took over Spain, and then eventually became Andalusia. Now, if I could show you culture, which I can't from this map, I don't want to hit play yet. Andalusia is probably 70% German culture, and that's because of Germany being so aggressive, and Germany does still own large chunks of Germany. So lots of military ideas, lots of expansion ideas. Their armies should be really quite strong, and aggressive expansion impact minus 20%. If you want to play an aggressive game, play as Germany. Right, that's them covered. I think that's all of those. Holland are an interesting one. They are a merchant republic, so they are very trade orientated, but I didn't want that to be their only thing. Like, yes, they do get some pretty nice naval abilities, but actually Holland was the target of a lot of Norse attacks because Zeeland is a Norse holy site. So it is kind of mitigated by a lot of religiousy stuff, hence the missionary strength plus 3. Plus, they're kind of a little bastion in a sea of Catholicism over here, so they're going to need something to be able to survive and expand with. So their armies are strong. Like, do not underestimate the Dutch armies, especially later on when they get this guy. Plus 15% land fire damage, plus 2 naval leader fire, which means, they're really good at shooting stuff. Them and Konungard are like the gunpowder aficionados. That's aficionados, that's the word. Alright, talking about armies, there is no nation in this game that represents a military better than the Navarrese Company. This is actually France. What happened in Crusader Kings II is that France was hiring the Navarrese Company, was unable to pay them. The Navarrese Company rebelled against them, beat France, and took the title for themselves. The Navarrese Company is a legit country now. So this is absolutely 100% an army with a state, which I freaking love. Like, a really good way of representing that, one of the commenters mentioned in one of the previous videos, was to make them a Prussian monarchy, which they start with, unlike Prussia. So they are absolutely the army with a state. So they have the Prussian monarchy abilities, which gives them the discipline, the militarization, and all that stuff, and the war exhaustion reductions, which are so strong. So do not ever underestimate the Navarrese company military. Early on, it's a bit... yeah, it's okay. It's big thanks to the mercenary maintenance and available mercenaries here, and they take less shock damage because they're trained. They get high discipline later on, but then eventually they get things like this: plus 10% morale, plus 10 infantry ability, land fire damage, yearly army tradition decay. They just become really, really strong militarily. So they'll be interesting. They'll be really, really interesting. Okay, so let's talk about Australasia. Australasia was probably the most successful, with the exception of Italy, of the Catholic nations. And in this, with my test games, they do blob. Very frequently, like in 1 or 2 games, I've seen them take the whole of France, a big chunk of Spain, and a big chunk of Germany. So they definitely become the big blue blob. The reason for that is they have an interest. They're quite a balanced. In fact, they're extremely balanced. They have a good mix of religion, so yearly papal influence. They're one of 2 nations that get that. Missionary strength, diplomatic relations, which allows them to have more allies. Diplomatic reputation, again, better allies. Manpower, land force limits. They start with a relatively small army, but thanks to their position being extremely wealthy part of the world, they can just field really big armies just from the outset. Aquitaine are my experimental nation. These guys are super diplomatic, like super duper diplomatic, because in Crusader Kings II they just kept a really low profile. They kept on expanding, they kept on growing, but they never really seemed to piss anyone off. And I thought the best way of showing that is through alliances and diplomacy. So national unrest, stability cost, yearly prestige, and then here we go. Diplomatic reputation +2, improve relations, cavalry combat thanks to the knights, diplomatic relations +2, and then they start getting some colonial stuff. Not to the same level as the Norse guys, but they get global settler increase and tariffs, so their colonies will be more productive. Right, Andalusia. This is the remnants of the German crusade. So they do have quite a few military abilities still, so stability cost, missionary strength, and then discipline +10 as the capstone. They were also fairly diplomatic, though. They made a lot of friends with Catholic nations, which allowed them to expand and conquer. And then culture conversion, because like I said, most of this is now German. And I think that is a trait which will continue. Fort defense, land force limits, ideas, naval force, construction, trade efficiency. So that is Andalusia. Who else do I need to talk about? Italy. Italy were the second strongest nation in... third strongest nation in Crusader Kings II. First was certainly the Scandinavian Empire, which consisted of the whole of Scandinavia, all of this in Russia, Egypt, and then this part of India. That's been split up, obviously. But Italy was generally able to rival us militarily, and generally if Italy joined a crusade or a holy war against us, we would lose that war. So I have made sure that they remain powerful. Now, Italy itself may look fairly fragmented at the moment. It's not actually quite so bad. Most of that are vassals, and they do consolidate power here relatively quickly. The exceptions are Sicily down here in the south, and then any of the Byzantine-owned stuff, which they would obviously have to fight a very strong Byzantium for. Now, this does leave a couple of nations in a fairly poor position. So Venice, which did never become a Venetian city-state, this is actually a bishopric, although they still have the Venetian ideas, which haven't changed. So that's going to be an interesting trading theocracy. Okay, we'll see how that works. Haven't changed that. Plus, they have Genoa and Amalfi, plus the Papal States. So there's a lot going on in Italy. So Genoa. Genoa are a financier merchant republic. So I've tried to stay a bit true to the Genoese ideas because I quite like them. So they have less interest per annum. They have more Republican tradition. They are the only one to have Republican tradition. I probably should have given some to Amalfi, but Amalfi is already really, really strong because Amalfi and Genoa are the original merchant republics. The others were the ones that I created. So they have they can get a lot of money very cheaply, which they can then convert into mercenaries and ships. Cheaper development, they're in Italy, they tend to be in very rich areas, trade efficiency and merchants. So they are also another long-range trading power, trade steering, as you can see. So they'll be relying on building lots and lots of light ships and then using their money to finance any wars that they're fighting. which is in contrast to Amalfi. Amalfi in Crusader Kings II was the largest financially of the Crusader Kings II merchant republics, and I kind of wanted to show that, but they were not very adventurous. They had the Mediterranean locked down. It was very difficult to compete with them in the Med, and their ideas reflect that, but they weren't particularly interested in going outside of the Mediterranean, so they don't have, for example, trade steering. What they do have is a lot of global trade power, which allows them to at least pull some trade in. Naval force limits, they have a humongous navy, again, locking down the Mediterranean. That's their entire theme here. Galley combat ability, plus 40%. So while Amalfi has amazing galleys, Genoa actually has the potential to get more ships long term, although their naval force limit is lower, they're richer, and their ship costs are down 20%, while Amalfi I think is only at 10%. Sorry, that's Papal State. That's Sicily. There's Amalfi. So they have combat ability, merchants, embargo efficiency. They're the only merchant republic to have that. So if someone pisses them off, consider yourselves embargoed, and that's going to cost you a lot of money in this area. Available mercenaries, far less than Genoa. Durability, privateer efficiency, and chance to capture enemy ships. This is an ability I didn't even know existed. You have a increased chance of taking ships in naval combat, so don't go to war with Amalfi is basically what this is saying. Because they will hand you your ass. They're quite content to just sit in this area and take stuff, but don't fight them. Okay, I'm just going to very quickly glance through my notes to see if that was all of the nations that I wanted to talk about. I think it was. No, it wasn't. I can see two already that I've forgotten. Alright, let's talk about those. So first of all, we're going to talk about Burgundy. Burgundy were really interesting. They were a nation which voluntarily switched to Norse for a very long time. Like this part of France was Norse for quite a long time. And oddly so, because I just wasn't able to defend them. They have since switched back to Catholic, but I basically said a lot of their Norse influences have remained. So like some of the other Norse nations, they have the free explorers and colonist, and a massive global settler increase. The other reason for that is they own Iceland, so they are the Catholic colonial nation. It's not Andalusia, it's Burgundy. They also have much cheaper and better light ships. That's the Viking longboats. Again, this is their Viking heritage. They're also the most tolerant of all of the Catholic nations, so religious unity plus 20%, and then they have national unrest reduction as well, meaning they're going to be very, very stable, and they should be able to grow pretty strong, especially with colonial nations. And then finally, we have Saxony. Saxony. The thorn in my side for such a sodding long time. Saxony were the nation I could not beat. I just couldn't beat them. So I have taken that into consideration here, and I've made them pretty strong. They're not strong in the sense of having big, strong armies, but they are strong in the sense that it's freaking impossible to conquer them. And I have seen, and this is no joke, Saxony take over the whole of Scandinavia in EU4. It has happened on more than one occasion. Saxony, tiny Saxony, split up, fragmented Saxony. This is Saxony, this is Saxony, this is Saxony, and this is Saxony. Actually manages to take Scandinavia. So what makes them so strong? Well, they have ridiculous fort defense. They have hostile core creation costs. So people don't like going to war with Saxony, but Saxony likes going to war with other people. But it will only do it on their own terms once they have allies. Actually, they don't have diplomatic ideas, but they seem able to get allies anyway because they're very often fighting the Norse. So as part of that, they have missionary strength and they have yearly papal influence. Now, that is important because, like I said, only two nations have papal influence, and this guy gets double that of Australasia. And what that means is they can very easily dominate the Curia, and they can very easily afford to buy the papal modifiers, so like the increased force limits, the increased tax modifier, the decreased interest rates and inflation. And those can be really, really strong if you start getting a number of them together. And Saxony is able to. So thanks to their religious bonuses, they're really strong. Again, fort maintenance, garrison size, cavalry combat ability, tax modifier, army tradition, unrest. And then capped off by 15% in discipline. So yeah, Saxony, another really, really strong fighting nation. And they would be interesting to play as, legitimately. Gotland, that's the other one I forgot about. Gotland actually uses the Gatish, I think is what they're called, ideas from EU4, except I've doubled them. Like Gotland's ideas were already really, really strong, and then I doubled them. So Gotland is totally, unabashedly overpowered, but it's a one province minor stuck in the middle of the Baltic, so I think they're allowed to be. Plus they were the place where it all started for the March of the Vikings, so I was like, what the hell, I have a massive soft spot for them. So core creation, privateer efficiency, trade efficiency, they are a merchant republic, development cost, mercenary maintenance, ship costs, yeah, their ideas are good. 50% naval force limits, interest per annum. Alright, so that's Gotland talked about. Bilge, I've done. Amalfi, Patriarchy, I've done all of those. Sure, I've done that. Navarrese, yeah, done all those. Done those. Okay, so there are two nations which stand out in this. In fact, there's three. I haven't really touched Avaria because they tend to stay relatively quiet. They still have the dynamically generated ideas. Poland, however, does not. Poland uses the Polish ideas. And Poland is really, really strong in this. Like, I've seen Poland rising to become a very major regional power to contest virtually everyone else. Like Poland, Common Guard, Home Guard, very often fighting each other, and Poland tends to come out on top. So I didn't think I needed to change them at all. They're perfectly fine as they are. Likewise with Byzantium. Byzantium has the generic vanilla ideas. Sorry, not generic, just the vanilla Byzantine ideas, and they suit them just fine. Alright, well, I think that is the complete overview for this game. I tried to keep it to 30 minutes, but it's gone up to 40, but so it goes. So I do need to make a few tweaks to the idea choices, like the idea groups selections, like innovative and colonial, expansionist and exploration and all that. For some of the Catholic nations in particular, otherwise they just don't seem to colonize, which is annoying. I'd like them to, because I want this to be a contested colonial game. So I need to make a few tweaks like that, but I would say that we are pretty much on schedule to start this series in earnest tomorrow, otherwise the day after. So look out for it then. I very much hope that you will join me for it. Thank you very much for watching this. If you are enjoying this and if you are looking forward to the game, then let me know by liking the video. And likewise, if you haven't done so already, then do consider subscribing. And if you just want to talk about any of the stuff you've seen here, if you have any last minute suggestions for changes, let me know in the comments below. I'm always really interested in reading those, and I absolutely love interacting with you guys. I can't wait for this series to start. It's going to be fantastic. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Goodbye.